"What's your rank, lady?" He said it like a punchline, loud enough that the two operators flanking him cracked into laughter before they had even seen who he was talking to. The corridor outside the gear-up bay at Building 3300 had that closed-in metal smell of salt water and old paint, and the woman he had just shoulder-checked was still steadying herself against the bulkhead. She was small, mid-50s, a navy blue cardigan, soft-soled flats, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, the kind of woman you might pass in a grocery store without seeing. Senior Chief Brick Holloway saw her and decided she did not belong. "I asked you a question," he said, taking one step closer. "What's your rank? Because I'm trying to figure out how a civilian got past my gate without me knowing about it." He turned half toward his two teammates, grinning. "Maybe she's a tour guide. You here for the tour, ma'am?" The two operators laughed again, but quieter this time. Something in the woman's face had stopped them. She was not afraid. She was not embarrassed. She was simply looking at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has just announced he does not need to study for the test. "I am walking the base," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I have an access pass." "Yeah, let me see it." She did not move. She looked at him for another half-second. Then her eyes drifted past his shoulder to the printed sign mounted above the bulkhead, the one every restricted access corridor on a military installation in the United States is required to display. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1382. Unlawful entry on a military installation. She read it without reading it aloud, the way someone confirms a fact they already know. Then she tucked the printed access pass deeper into her cardigan. The lanyard inside it had no name on the front. The back was a different story. If this opening is hitting for you, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to see how this one ends.
2 hours earlier, at the main gate of Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, Fort Story, the woman in the Navy cardigan had pulled up in a silver sedan she had driven herself. No flag on the hood, no protocol car behind her, no aide in the passenger seat. Just her, a worn leather portfolio on the seat beside her, and a paper coffee cup from a gas station off Shore Drive. The gate sentry, a young petty officer with 2 months of qualifications under his belt, leaned down toward the driver's side window and asked her for credentials. She handed them through. He looked at the pass, looked at her, and called over a supervisor. Lieutenant Commander Fletcher Maddox was the watch officer for the morning shift. He glanced at the pass. He glanced at the woman. His face settled into the particular politeness that was not really politeness at all. "Ma'am, is someone meeting you on base?" "No." "You were driving yourself in?" "That is correct." He scanned the pass through the reader. It came up green. He scanned it a second time. It came up green a second time. He frowned, as if the system itself had made a mistake he was going to have to forgive it for. "All right, ma'am. Keep your pass visible. Speed limit's 15 on the installation. Visitor parking is on your left after the second light." "Thank you," she said, and drove through. Maddox watched the sedan disappear around the bend toward the seawall. Then he turned to the young sentry and said, almost to himself, "Who in the world cleared that?" The sentry did not answer. He had already moved on to the next car. At 8:35 in the morning, Naomi Ashford was standing on the seawall with the wind in her hair and a paper cup of cooling coffee in her hand. The Atlantic was the color of slate. A pair of patrol boats was working a slow circle out past the buoy line, and the gulls were doing what gulls do, fighting over something neither of them wanted to share. She watched the boats for a long time, then she walked. She walked through the maintenance hangar where she stood for 10 minutes watching a corrosion control team strip paint from a panel that had been improperly logged. She walked through the chow hall during the tail end of breakfast, and she stood in the back of the line behind 2 seamen who did not know she was there, and she listened. She walked the perimeter road. She walked through the small base library. She walked past the chapel without going in. And every place she went, she did the same 3 things. She observed, She took a small notation in a leather notebook the size of her palm, and she put the notebook back into the second of 3 pockets sewn into the inside lining of her cardigan. The first pocket held her access pass, the second held the notebook and a short pencil, the third held her phone, turned off and face down. The arrangement had been a habit since she was 22 years old, and she had never once in 36 years had to dig for anything she needed. Across the base, in a small office on the second floor of the administrative building, the base protocol officer was reading the same memo for the 3rd time and not enjoying it any more than she had the first 2. Lieutenant Bellatrix Vance set the paper down on her desk and looked up at her assistant. "Tell me again how this got onto my calendar." "It came down from the Pentagon Liaison Office Friday afternoon, ma'am, listed as a courtesy visit, no protocol required." "Then why is it on my calendar?" "Because every visitor is on your calendar, ma'am. That is the policy." Vance made a small, tired sound. She had been a base protocol officer for 2 years and 7 months, and she had learned to identify the kind of visit that was going to ruin her morning before she even read the file. A civilian observer with no escort and no Pentagon handler was either a school board member, a contractor's spouse who pulled a favor, or somebody from a small local paper trying to write a piece about how the Navy was spending taxpayer dollars. None of those people ever wanted to see anything useful. They wanted a photo by a flagpole and a cup of coffee in the wardroom, and they wanted to be home by lunch. "What is her name?" "Naomi Ashford." Vance frowned. The name did not ring any bell at all, which only confirmed her theory. She picked up her coffee and stood up. She would find this Ashford woman. She would walk her around for an hour. They would get her a souvenir patch and put her back in her car. She did not find her in an hour. Naomi was, at that moment, sitting at a small table by herself in the corner of the chow hall, drinking a fresh cup of coffee, this one better than the gas station one, and watching a chief in a flight suit gesture broadly to a group of young aviators. A chow worker mopping near her table stopped and looked at her with the kind of soft puzzlement that comes from seeing something out of place.
"Ma'am, are you lost?" "No," she said. "I am right where I want to be." "You waiting on somebody?" "No." He hesitated, then nodded slowly and moved on. He glanced back once before he disappeared into the kitchen. She finished her coffee. Outside, on the path between the chow hall and the recreation building, a yeoman in working uniform spotted her, slowed his pace, and asked if she needed a ride somewhere. She said no, thank you. He said he could call her a ride. She said no, thank you, again. He stood watching her for a moment after she walked past, as if he was deciding whether to make a phone call about her, and then decided not to. By 10:15 in the morning, Naomi Ashford had walked roughly 4 miles of installation pavement, had observed 17 separate procedural items worth a notation in her leather notebook, and had not yet been asked by a single person on the base what her access level actually was. That was about to change. Building 3300 sat at the far end of the operational compound, a low concrete structure with a checkpoint at the only public side entrance. The corridor beyond the checkpoint led to the gear-up bay, the brief room, and a secure office suite that, on the building diagram posted outside, was simply labeled Operations. Naomi had been in that building 4 times in the past 6 years. She had walked the corridor every one of those times. This time, the watch officer at the checkpoint reader was Lieutenant Commander Fletcher, the same man who had cleared her at the main gate that morning. He recognized her immediately, and his face did that small recalibration it had at 6:28 earlier in the day. "Ma'am, pass, please." She handed it to him. He ran it through the reader. The reader beeped green. He looked at the screen, frowned, and ran it again. Green again. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, holding the pass between 2 fingers as if he was not sure what to do with it. Then he came back.
Ma'am, you are going to need to wait here while I make a call. How long? Just a few minutes. How many is a few? He did not answer her. He picked up the desk phone and turned away from her. She watched him speak quietly into the receiver for almost 2 full minutes. When he hung up, he came back to the counter, and the polite but not polite smile was now just a flat line. Ma'am, I am going to need you to step back from this entry. This is a restricted corridor. Your pass is showing valid in the system, but until I can verify what level of access you have actually been cleared for, I cannot allow you to proceed. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the wall behind the counter. Mounted there at eye level in a black frame with a metal placard underneath was the regulatory notice required by federal law on every restricted military entry point. She had read it many times in her life. She read it again now. Lieutenant Commander, the notice posted behind you cites Title 18, United States Code, Section 1382. Are you familiar with the statute? He blinked. Ma'am, She reads in her head. It requires 2 elements for a trespass. The first is notice. The second is a refusal to leave after being directed to do so. You have not at any point in our interaction directed me to leave. Ma'am, I am not arresting you. I am asking you to wait. I understand. I am waiting. I am asking you to record this interaction on the watch log. The watch log is for incidents, ma'am. This is procedure. I would like a record of it.
He looked at her, she looked at him. 20 seconds went by. Then he turned to the keyboard at the counter and began typing, slowly, the way a man types when he is not sure what to type. She watched his hands. He stopped after 3 lines, and she could see from where she was standing that he had not entered the timestamp. She did not point this out. She took the small leather notebook from the second pocket of her cardigan and wrote down the time herself, 10:41 in the morning. She put the notebook back. Lieutenant Commander, who did you just call? That is not your concern, ma'am. It is, but I will not press it right now. Behind her, footsteps approached down the entry hallway. Sharp, measured, expensive footsteps, the kind of footsteps that announce, before anyone speaks, that something has just been escalated. Lieutenant Bellatrix Vance was in her best uniform, which was a small thing she did on Mondays because Mondays felt like that kind of day, and she covered the distance between the administrative building and Building 3300 in just under 9 minutes. By the time she reached the checkpoint, she had already decided how this was going to go. She had handled a dozen of these over the years. A misplaced civilian gets too far into a building, the watch officer panics, protocol comes in, smooths it out, sends the civilian to a lounge with a cup of coffee until somebody from her actual department arrives to collect her. The whole thing takes 20 minutes if you handle it right. She walked up to Naomi with the kind of smile that women who have learned to navigate male-dominated workplaces deploy on other women they have already decided are beneath them. Mrs. Ashford, I am Lieutenant Vance, Base Protocol. I am so sorry for the confusion this morning. Why don't we get you settled in the visitor lounge while we sort all this out? It is Miss Ashford. Of course, Miss Ashford. The lounge is just... I would like to speak to the duty officer. The smile did not quite slip, but it tightened at the corners. Ma'am, that is really not necessary. I am here and I would like to speak to the duty officer. The exact same words, the exact same tone, as if she were reading them off a card. Lieutenant Commander Maddox can arrange it, or you can. I do not mind which. Vance's eyes flicked to Maddox, who was standing very still behind the counter and back. Something in her was beginning to understand that this was not a school board visit and was not a contractor's spouse, but she had not yet caught up to where exactly on the spectrum of unpleasant Mondays this was going to land. Of course, ma'am. I will page Captain Pruitt's office. Thank you.
While Vance turned away to make the page, the door at the end of the entry hallway opened, and 3 men in operators' cuts came through it, talking among themselves and not looking where they were going. The man in the middle was a head taller than the other 2, with shoulders that had been built somewhere other than a gym. He saw the woman standing at the counter, did not slow down, and as he passed, he turned his upper body slightly so that his right shoulder caught hers and rocked her hard against the bulkhead. Senior Chief Brick Holloway did not apologize. He did not even look at her. He kept walking, and as he reached the door at the other end of the corridor, he said, loud enough for the whole entryway to hear, "What's your rank, lady?" That was the moment the story we opened with had been waiting for. 2 operators behind him laughed. One of them did not. The one who did not was a junior petty officer named Silas Coffey, a 3rd class with 8 months on station, and he stopped 2 steps past her, turned around and said quietly, "Ma'am, do you need anything?" She looked at him. It was, at that point, the 8th hour of her morning, and he was the first person on the base who called her ma'am the way the word was meant to be used. "No, thank you, Petty Officer Coffey." He blinked. He had not given her his name. His name was on the patch on his chest, but most people did not read the patch. She had read the patch. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He glanced once at Brick Holloway's back, disappearing through the far door, then once at Vance, still on the phone, and then he walked on. But his pace was different now. He was walking the way a man walks when he is making a decision he has not finished making yet. Across the operational compound, in a small windowless room behind the security office, Master-at-Arms 2nd Class Royd Calderon was looking at his monitor with a half-eaten breakfast sandwich in one hand. The visitor log had a flag on it. He had not put the flag there himself, but he was the duty operator, and the flag was waiting for someone to do something about it. The flag read, "Visitor, Unverified, Review." The visitor's name was Ashford, Naomi. He thought about it for a moment. He took another bite of his sandwich. Then he tabbed over to the manual entry field, and instead of clicking the Verify button, which would have taken him about 4 seconds, he typed 3 letters into the status field. He typed TBD. Then he highlighted it, deleted it, and instead typed Unverified, Possible Trespass, Under Review. He saved the entry. He closed the window. He went back to his sandwich. It was, in the grand scheme of his career, the worst decision he would ever make. He did not know that yet. If this story is pulling you in, hit subscribe so part 2 lands the second it goes live. You're not going to want to miss what happens when those 4 generals walk in.
Captain Edmar Pruitt arrived at the Building 3300 checkpoint at 11:17 in the morning, which was 4 minutes after Vance had paged him, 3 minutes after Calderon had updated the log, and 17 minutes after Brick Holloway had asked a woman with a federal access pass what her rank was. He was the executive officer of the base. He had been the executive officer for 14 months. He was 22 months away from his terminal retirement date, and he had built his entire late career on the principle that things that could be made to go away quietly should be made to go away quietly. He looked at Naomi Ashford in her navy cardigan and her soft-soled flats, and he made his assessment in roughly the same 5 seconds it had taken Brick Holloway to make his. He drew the same conclusion. He was just better dressed about it. "Ms. Ashford, why don't we step into the conference room and sort this out?" He gestured to a door off the side of the entry hallway. Vance followed them in. Maddox stayed at his counter. Naomi sat down on one side of a small oval table. Pruitt sat down on the other. Vance took a chair against the wall. "I understand there has been some confusion about your access. I would like to apologize for that. We get a lot of visitors through here, and sometimes the paperwork does not catch up to the day of." "My pass scanned green at every reader."
Yes, ma'am, I understand that, but there is a difference between a pass scanning green and the system having a complete record of your authorization. Sometimes the back end takes a day or two to populate. You have had my authorization for 11 business days. He paused. I am sorry? 11 business days, counting today. He smiled. It was a thin smile he probably practiced in a mirror at some point, and that worked on most people. Ms. Ashford, I do not think you have a clear picture of how the back-end clearance system works in our... He did not finish the sentence because the conference room door opened without a knock and Brick Holloway walked in. The senior chief was holding a coffee cup. He had clearly stepped in to find Pruitt about something else entirely, because he didn't even look at the woman in the navy cardigan as he came through the door. He looked at Pruitt and said, "Sir, I needed to grab you about..." Then his eyes drifted left, and he saw her, and his face did the thing his face did. "Oh, hey, lady from the corridor." He looked at Pruitt. "She still hasn't told me her rank, sir." Vance made a small choking sound. Pruitt did not. "Senior Chief, this is a meeting in progress." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Just wanted to flag it." He turned to walk out, then turned back, grinning. "I mean, no rank, right? Just walking around? That's what we're calling it?" Naomi did not look at him. She set her leather portfolio on the table, opened it, and removed a single sheet of paper. She slid the sheet across the table to Pruitt. "Captain, I would like you to pull today's base access manifest." "Ms. Ashford." "You do not need to. I have a copy. This is it." Pruitt looked at the sheet. He did not pick it up. The top half of the sheet was a standard installation access manifest, watermarked, dated that morning, with 23 entries on it. The third entry from the bottom had a name on it that had been redacted with a black bar. Pruitt looked at the redacted bar. Then his eyes drifted to the bottom of the sheet, to the chain of custody footer, which is the small block of text that records who generated the document, who certified it, and under what authority. The footer was 3 lines long. He read them all 3. He read them a second time. The thin smile he had practiced in his mirror was no longer on his face. He set his own coffee cup down very carefully on the table, as if he was suddenly worried about the surface underneath it. "Senior Chief, step out of the room. Close the door." "Sir?" "Step out, close the door." Senior Chief Brick Holloway, who had spent 22 years in the United States Navy and been in 3 different combat theaters, recognized the change in Pruitt's voice, even if he didn't understand it. He stepped out. He closed the door. He did not, however, walk away from the door. He stood in the entry hallway with his coffee cup, looking at the closed door, trying to figure out what had just happened. Inside the conference room, Pruitt looked across the table at the woman in the navy cardigan and the soft-soled flats. He did not call her ma'am. He did not call her Mrs. Ashford. He called her by the name she gave Vance 40 minutes ago, and he called her by it the way a man calls another person by their name when he has suddenly realized he should have been calling them by it from the beginning.
Miss Ashford, I would like to start this conversation over. That is not necessary. With respect, ma'am, I think it is. Vance, against the wall, was watching the exchange with the slow, dawning expression of a person who had just realized she had walked into a room with the wrong assumption and been broadcasting that assumption out loud for the past 5 minutes. Naomi closed the portfolio. She placed her hands flat on the cover. "Captain, I would like to ask you 3 questions. I would like honest answers." "Yes, ma'am." "First, the flag on my visitor entry. Who entered it?" "I do not know. I can find out." "Find out." "Second, the note in the security log that classified me as a potential trespasser. Who entered it?" "I can find that out as well." "Find that out as well." "Third," she paused. She waited for him to look at her, not just listen, but look. He looked. "How long has Senior Chief Holloway been making the comments like the one he made twice in this building this morning?" Pruitt did not answer that one.
He did, however, do one thing. His right hand drifted across the table toward the small, secure desk phone mounted in the corner of the conference room, the phone that connected directly to the base commanding officer's private line. His fingers reached the receiver. They paused there. He thought about the bottom 3 lines of the chain of custody footer. He thought about the redacted name on the manifest. He thought about the 11 business days. He thought about the phrase Miss Ashford and how he had not, until this moment, run the name through anything more sophisticated than his own assumptions. His fingers withdrew from the receiver without lifting it. He had, in that moment, 2 options. He could pick up the phone and call the base commanding officer, who would arrive within 4 minutes and would want to know why his executive officer had been sitting across a conference room table with the 3rd-ranking civilian in the Department of the Navy without recognizing her. Or he could try very quickly to figure out how to handle this himself. He chose the second option. It was the worst decision he would make that morning, and there were, by then, several worse decisions competing for the title. Drop a comment with 1 word for what you think is on the back of that lanyard, and hit subscribe so Part 2 lands the moment it goes live. Outside the conference room, in the entry hallway, Brick Holloway was still standing with his coffee cup, watching the closed door. He had been raised in a house in eastern Pennsylvania where his father had taught him that the worst thing a man could do was let a problem stand around getting bigger when he could solve it. He had spent 2 decades in the Navy applying that principle, with varying degrees of success. He set his coffee cup down on the small table by the door. He squared his shoulders. He prepared, in his head, the words he was going to use when he stepped back into that room to explain to whoever this woman thought she was that this was his building, on his base, and that nobody who walked through that gate without an escort and without a name on the bulletin got to sit at a conference table dictating terms to his XO. He put his hand on the door handle. He did not get to turn it. Lieutenant Vance opened the door from the inside before he could, and her face was the color of cold milk. She looked at him. She looked past him. She looked at him again. Then she said the only thing she could think to say, which was, "Senior Chief, don't." He looked at her. "Don't what?" "Just don't." She closed the door in his face. Senior Chief Brick Holloway stood in the entry hallway of Building 3300 with his coffee cooling on the side table, and he understood for the first time that morning that he might have misjudged something. He did not yet know how badly. That part was still on its way.
Inside the conference room, Naomi Ashford had not moved. Her hands were still flat on the cover of the leather portfolio. Pruitt was still looking at the chain of custody footer at the bottom of the manifest. Vance had returned to her chair against the wall with the deliberate care of a person trying not to make any noise that might draw attention to herself. Naomi spoke quietly. "Captain, there is a woman walking up the path outside this building. She arrived at the visitor center 40 minutes ago. Her name is Sabira Lennox. She is with the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. She is here at my invitation. She will be at the front door of this building in approximately 90 seconds. Pruitt's eyes lifted from the manifest. "Ma'am, When she arrives, you are going to escort her to this room. You are going to sit in that chair, and you and I and Miss Lennox are going to spend the next hour going through the items in this portfolio. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Lieutenant Vance." Vance straightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Please ask Lieutenant Commander Maddox to step away from his counter and join us. Please also locate Master-at-Arms Second Class Calderon. He is on shift in the security office. I would like him in this room as well.
Yes, ma'am. And Lieutenant. Yes, ma'am. Please ask Senior Chief Holloway to wait in the entry hallway. Do not let him leave the building. Vance left. The door closed behind her. Pruitt sat across the table, looking at a woman he had introduced himself to less than 10 minutes earlier, and he understood now that the morning he thought he was having was not the morning he was actually having, and had not been since 6:28. Sabira Lennox arrived at 11:32 with a black file box under one arm and an identification badge clipped to her jacket. She was in her early 40s, with a federal investigator's particular kind of patience, and she set the file box on the conference table without asking permission to do so. What followed was not dramatic. It was, in fact, the opposite of dramatic. It was procedural. It was slow. It was the sound of paper being turned and timestamps being read aloud, and it was for the 4 people who were brought into that room one at a time over the next 90 minutes, the worst kind of quiet there is. The first item Sabira read aloud was a transcript of audio recovered from a gate-side body cam. The timestamp was 9:47 in the morning. The officer was identified by badge number 4471, which was Lieutenant Commander Fletcher Maddox. The audio captured a conversation between Maddox and the young sentry in which Maddox said of a credential he had just personally scanned green twice that it was probably fake and that they should hold the visitor at the secondary checkpoint until somebody figured out what to do about her. Maddox, sitting in a chair on the other side of the table, did not respond. His ears had gone red. The second item was an email. The subject line read, "Visitor, handle quietly." The sender field was Pruitt's account. The recipient field had been redacted. The body of the email, 3 sentences long, instructed the recipient to keep Naomi's visit off the daily situational awareness summary and to route any questions about her access to him personally. The email was dated 3 days before her arrival. Pruitt did not respond either. He was looking at his own hands. The third item was a contractor invoice from a company called Talon Vector LLC, reference number JEB-LC-2024-0418. The invoice was for $1.4 million in training hours that, when cross-referenced against the range logs for the same dates, did not match anything that had actually taken place on the installation. Sabira read the discrepancy aloud. She set the invoice down. She picked up a second invoice. She read that one too. By the 5th invoice, Pruitt had stopped looking at his hands and had started looking at the wall. The 4th item was the recording of a 911 call placed from a base extension at 10:22 in the morning. The caller was a junior sailor who reported what he described as harassment of a civilian visitor by base personnel. The call had been received by the regional dispatcher, who had attempted to route it to the base duty office, where it had been intercepted, logged as a misdial, and closed without a follow-up. The junior sailor's name was Silas Coffey. Calderon, who had been brought into the room 10 minutes earlier and had not yet been asked a question, made a small sound at the back of his throat. Sabira looked at him.
Petty Officer Calderon, the visitor log entry classifying Miss Ashford as a possible trespasser, under review. Did you enter that note? He did not answer right away. Petty Officer, yes, ma'am. Did anyone direct you to enter that note? A longer pause this time. No, ma'am. Thank you. She made a small mark on a page in her file box. She turned to the next page. It went on like that for 40 more minutes. Naomi did not say a word during any of it. She sat with her hands on the portfolio, and she watched each of the 4 faces in turn, and the only motion she made was to occasionally close her eyes for 2 or 3 seconds, the way a person closes their eyes when they are storing something away for later. When Sabira had finished with the last item in the file box, she closed the lid and looked at Naomi. "Ma'am, do you want to address the room?" "I do."
Naomi reached down beside her chair and lifted a sealed binder from the floor. She had brought it in from the sedan that morning, and it had been sitting at her feet through every minute of the conversation. She set it on the table. She broke the seal on the binder with her thumb. She opened it to the first page, which was a Department of Defense Form 1610, travel authorization, with her name printed at the top in block letters and her signature at the bottom. Above the signature, in the small block that identifies the signing authority, were the words she had said aloud to no one all morning. She read them aloud now. Naomi Ashford, Secretary of the Navy, acting under the authority of Title 10, United States Code, Section 5013. The room did not react the way rooms react in stories. There was no gasp. There was no sound at all. Pruitt closed his eyes. Vance, against the wall, put one hand over her mouth. Maddox stared at the table. Calderon stared at Maddox. In the entry hallway outside the conference room, Senior Chief Brick Holloway was still waiting because Lieutenant Vance had told him to wait and because his coffee was now cold and there was nothing else to do. He was beginning to think that whoever the woman in the cardigan turned out to be, the smartest thing he could do was apologize quickly and loudly and on the record and let his chief of the boat sort out the rest. He did not get to do that either. The front door of Building 3300 opened from the inside before they could knock. The 4 flag officers came to attention. It was not theatrical. It was not slow. It was 4 men with the combined 17 stars on their collars doing the one thing they had been trained to do their entire careers when the senior civilian of their service department walked into a room. Brick Holloway, 6 feet behind them, stood with his coffee cup and watched 4 generals snap to attention in a corridor he had walked through 10,000 times. He looked at the woman in the Navy cardigan. She was looking past the generals at him. Senior Chief. His mouth had gone dry. "Ma'am, you asked my rank." "Ma'am, The answer is on the door behind you." He turned. The door behind him was the door to the conference room. There was no plaque on the door. There was no nameplate. There was only the small federal seal stenciled at eye level, the same seal that appeared on the inside cover of the binder she had just opened on the table, the seal of the Department of the Navy, the seal under which she served. He understood with the slow, sinking clarity of a man who has been wrong about something important for a long time that the answer had been on every door he had walked through that morning. He had simply not been looking at the doors. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Lieutenant Vance, from her chair against the wall, finally spoke, the words slipping out before she could catch them. "Oh my God." It was the only sound in the room. What happened over the following weeks did not look like what people imagine when they imagined consequences. It looked like what consequences actually look like inside a federal institution, which is to say, it looked like paper. Senior Chief Brick Holloway was placed on administrative leave pending review under Article 89 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, disrespect toward a superior commissioned officer, with the additional complication that the officer in question was the civilian head of his service department. His detachment commander was notified the following morning. His clearance was suspended pending the outcome of the review. He was not, however, immediately discharged. The process would take months. Lieutenant Commander Fletcher Maddox was relieved of watch duties and reassigned to administrative work pending the findings of the Inspector General. He retained his rank. He retained his pay. He did not retain the trajectory he had imagined for himself. Master-at-Arms Second Class Royd Calderon was flagged under Title 5, United States Code, Section 2302, Paragraph B, Subparagraph 8, the Federal Whistleblower Protection Statute, on the theory that his log entry had been a retaliatory act against a witness whose visit had been protected. He was placed on restricted duty. He requested a representative. He received one. Captain Edmar Pruitt submitted a request for early retirement 9 days after the incident. The request was declined pending the conclusion of the Inspector General's inquiry. He was not relieved of command, but the base commanding officer's aide began handling all his correspondence, which was a kind of relief without the word. Lieutenant Bellatrix Vance was not formally disciplined. She was, however, transferred to a billet in Norfolk, where she would no longer be the first face that visitors to Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, Fort Story, encountered. The Talon Vector contract was suspended on the 14th day after Naomi's visit, pending a Defense Contract Audit Agency review of approximately $14 million in invoices that did not match installation records. The audit was projected to take 18 months. The contractor's outside counsel was already, by week 3, negotiating a settlement framework. Ezra Bramwell, a defense beat reporter for the Tidewater Dispatch, broke the contractor story 11 days after the incident. He did not break the secretary's walkthrough. That story did not break for another 2 months, and when it did, it was the contractor's lawyers who leaked it, not the Navy, and the leak did not help them. 6 weeks after the incident, a policy memorandum was issued from the Office of the Secretary of the Navy that revised the procedures for civilian credentialed visits to operational installations. The memo was 4 pages long. It was widely circulated within the department. Whether it would be consistently enforced, particularly at installations whose budgets were already stretched, was a question that the memo itself did not answer. Petty Officer 3rd Class Silas Coffey received a handwritten letter from a chief he had never met, on stationery from an office he had never been to, acknowledging that his 911 call had been correctly routed and improperly suppressed, and that the proper authorities had been notified of the suppression. The letter did not mention Naomi Ashford by name. It did not need to. Silas put the letter in a drawer, and he put the drawer in his locker, and he did not show it to anyone for a long time. He did not receive a letter from Brick Holloway. He did not expect one. 2 threads of all the threads that ran through the morning of April 29th were never tied off. The first was the redacted recipient on Pruitt's email, the one whose subject line read, "Visitor, handle quietly." The redaction was a contractor's email address, and the contractor's outside counsel successfully argued, across 3 rounds of motions, that the identity of the recipient was protected under attorney-client privilege. The recipient was never publicly named. The Inspector General's report, when it was finally released 18 months later, referred to the recipient only as Individual A. The second was a 10-minute gap in the Building 3300 body cam footage between 10:31 and 10:41 in the morning. The gap was attributed in the official report to a system synchronization error. The system did not produce synchronization errors before that morning, and it did not produce one after. No further explanation was ever offered. No further explanation was ever demanded by anyone with the authority to demand it. The binder closed. The lanyard went back into the second pocket of the Navy cardigan. The sedan pulled out of the Little Creek main gate at 4:11 in the afternoon, and the same young petty officer who had checked her in that morning checked her out, and this time he did not call his supervisor. He looked at her. He looked at the pass. He looked at her again. He saluted, which was not procedure for a civilian credential, and which he could have been corrected on, but no one corrected him. She nodded back and drove. And somewhere in a small office in an industrial park north of Norfolk, in a building leased to a contractor called Talon Vector LLC, a paper shredder ran for 93 minutes straight on the afternoon of the 29th, and the man feeding documents into it did not stop until the bin was full, and then he carried the bin to a van, and the van drove away. And what was in the bin, and where the van went, was a question that nobody in the inquiry in any of its 18 months was ever able to answer. The story, the way stories are told on the internet, ended with the four generals snapping to attention and the woman in the navy cardigan saying the answer was on the door behind him. The story, the way it actually happened, ended somewhere else. It ended in 1,000 pieces of paper running through a shredder in a leased office that no one would ever fully investigate. It ended with a young petty officer keeping a letter in a drawer in a locker. It ended with a memorandum that might or might not be enforced. It ended with a man in administrative leave who, 18 months from that morning, would separate from the Navy under conditions that the public record would describe as honorable, because the alternative would have required a trial that no one in the chain of command wanted to hold. It ended for the woman in the Navy cardigan the way most of her days ended, at a desk, in an office, signing things. The pass she had carried that morning went into a small fireproof box she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk, along with 11 other passes from 11 other installations she had walked unannounced over the past 4 years. The box was almost full. She had a list of installations she had not yet walked. If you sat with this one all the way to the end, the most useful thing you can do is hit subscribe. There is another walkthrough story coming next week on a base that did not handle it as well as Little Creek did, and the consequences were a little harder to keep on paper. Tell me in the comments. The first person on the base who treated her with basic respect was a third-class petty officer 8 months on station. The last person to figure out who she was a senior chief with 22 years in. Why do you think that is? I am reading the answers. Stay sharp. The door behind you always has a seal on it. You just have to be looking.